Hey everybody, so I'm back with video number 2. Still kind of weird being in front of the camera, if I'm being honest, but I'm getting used to it, and at the very least it's exciting for me, so whatever. I mean, even if y'all don't like it, I'll have some fun, but whatever. I wanted to make a video today because I wanted to talk about something that I am incredibly fascinated by. It's called brain-computer interface. So the reason why I think this subject is so fascinating is because it is one of those topics that is here and now. It's very present day. For the past 100 or so years, we've been making lots of interesting discoveries in psychology and biology and chemistry and these things, and these fields lend themselves a little bit more closely to experiment. So when you want to do an experiment in psychology, you can do things like, say you wanted to study attention. You could have someone pay attention to one thing or pay attention to another thing. You could have distractors in the way, and you can do things like measure reaction time. You can do things like, you can see if maybe you can present a stimulus without the person even noticing that it came into their own visual field. And all of those fields, I guess psychology is a bit more comfortable with experiment in terms of some very specific cases like attention, or maybe in some ways intelligence is a little bit easier to study, and in some ways there are some very basic components to psychology that can be studied, but it's difficult to study, say, how humans interact with each other. That requires a lot of really intense thinking about how do you create an experiment where there's something to be measured in order to really learn something valuable about psychology. It tends to be even easier in biology and even easier in chemistry beneath that, and then physics, and I think at the bottom of that you have math, where you don't even really necessarily need to conduct an experiment in the real world to know that if I take one pencil and put it with another pencil, then I have two pencils at the end of that. So I think that science is very much geared towards these lower level disciplines. And when I say lower level, I don't mean that they're in any way easier. I think that physics and math and chemistry and biology are incredibly difficult subjects. But they are lower in the sense that they are the more fundamental building blocks that the more complicated features are built on top of. And that's part of why I'm so fascinated with computer-brain interface. For a long time now, we have been building throughout society a body of knowledge. I mean, when I think about where this all starts, I go all the way back to the Greeks, and maybe even before that. You can think of maybe the first early humans that made fire. In some way they were doing experiments, but once we learned how to make fire, we passed that on. We taught our children, we taught our friends, our neighbors, and things like that. And the same things happened at a very, very large scale with math, with physics, with chemistry, all of these things. And I think it's easy, now that we've come so far, to lose sight of what we were doing in the beginning. To me, I think one of the most interesting disciplines around is alchemy. I haven't studied or tried to spend too much time on that myself, but it's fascinating that as you go back through history, so many of the greatest scientists that you ever hear about dabbled in alchemy. And I think that is very representative of the sort of spirit of science. We've always wanted certain things in our life. We've always wanted magic. I think that even now there's a drive to understand the world because we love the idea of doing things that seem impossible. We want to go to the moon. We want to maybe help our friends and family live forever. I mean, when you think about the great stories of magic in literature, of course, you almost always come back to these ideas because they seem to be innate human drives. And I'm not going to get into the science of anything like that. I'm not really saying that in any sort of empirical sense. I just mean to say that I think that we all have a sort of fundamental ability to wonder about immortality, about flight. I think that flight is one of those things that will always fascinate humans. I mean, we descend from monkeys, and monkeys were always land-bound, or I guess you could go farther back and say we come from the water, but I think that our psychology developed under the constraints of being stuck to the earth. So when we see other animals, or if that's even the right word, if we see these other organisms out there like birds flying around, there's something fundamentally different about our capabilities than theirs. And I think that it doesn't quite capture our imagination in the same way to just say get on an airplane or even to fly an airplane. I think it's probably an incredible experience, and I'd like to do that someday myself, but I don't think that we'll ever capture that sense of wonder about flight and really feel as though we own it unless we find some way to use our own physiology to do it. I'm not saying that that's necessarily something we can do, but I think that's why we enjoy skydiving. We love the idea that we could pretend like we get to be something that we're not for a little while, and maybe something more than we already are. But the reason I wanted to bring up this sort of ability that we have to wonder about these amazing things is that is why I think we do science. It's not because we necessarily need to produce something like a business does. We don't necessarily need to make a product in science. We don't necessarily have to do anything with science. If we wanted, we could stop right here and we could just try and survive with what we have. I mean, that's what we've been doing since the beginning of time. And in some strange way, we already have sort of the things that we want. When I think about immortality, I think it's funny that in some way we already have it. When I'm a parent one day, hopefully, I will have a child, and that child won't just be some older version of myself that has worn out parts and has wear and tear from millions of years of use that has built up over time, and maybe there are aspects of that in the DNA, but in some sense that's a new beginning, and in some amount of time that new organism will reach a new prime. And I say organism referring to a child, but whatever, I'm a scientist. So I think it's incredible that in some way we already have achieved these things, but we're still left with this sense of wonder. And to me, I think that's part of my purpose for life. And many people, I think, feel this way, that we want to see what life has to offer. We want to try and squeeze the most out of it. And to me, I think the most interesting part of life in the 21st century is the prospect of working on brain-computer interface. And you'll hear me say that term a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into what that means. So brain-computer interface. Obviously, a brain is the sort of mechanism that controls some of what we do, or controls what we do with our bodies. It controls the way we move, and I'm not going to get into the semantics of the word control there, but I'd like to talk about that in a future video maybe. But our brain seems to coordinate all of the incredible functions that our body has to offer. And for me, when I think of the brain, I think of a computer. I genuinely think of this informational system that is responsible for taking in information from the world around it, using that information to decide on plans on how to act in the world, and then using the manifestations of the brain. And when I say manifestations of the brain, I'm actually referring to the body. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But our brain then uses these sort of apparatuses. Like when I say apparatus, I mean even my arm. Like in some way, my brain is just controlling my arm by manipulating variables, by thinking about information, and by changing that information. And all of that information seems to be represented electrically in the brain. So the brain is made out of neurons for the most part. And you can think of neurons as a little tiny light bulb. And it's a light bulb that has the ability to light up its neighbors. And in some way, the incredible symphony of lighting up neurons and neurons lighting up their neighbors in special, careful, algorithmic, and maybe even non-algorithmic ways seems to produce everything that we are. And it's difficult to really get at why that is except for diving into biology and chemistry and physics. I wish that I could do experiments without the need for understanding morality and these things, and that's not because I necessarily don't want morality involved in science, but just there are definite limitations to what we can do in science, because at the end of the day we're people and we don't want to just go around hurting others, we don't want to hurt animals, we don't want to hurt lots of things, and so we limit ourselves. But if morality were put aside, I would show you an experiment where I would put you in some sort of magnetic field, and I would use that magnetic field to dampen all of the electrical signals inside of your brain, and all kinds of weird things would go on. You'd see things, you might even twitch muscles that you didn't mean to twitch, you might hear things, you might smell things, and what all of that would be showing you would be that your experiences are built out of electricity. And there's definitely nuance to be had in that statement, but I think it's still a fair thing to say that almost all of what you do and almost all of what you feel is mitigated by light bulbs flashing in your brain, lighting up their neighbors. The way that we actually know this in psychology comes from lots of experiments where specific parts of the brain get taken out, and usually they're not taken out in some sort of electrical sense. Usually you have some sort of crazy freak injury back in the early 1900s or the late 1800s, where someone has a crazy brain injury and then all of a sudden they act entirely different, or they go blind, or they can't hear, or strange things like that. And each of those instances, those case studies, lead us to believe that our brain is responsible for our experiences. Let's take an analogy of something that is a part of the body that doesn't control our experiences. So imagine, and this is pretty morbid, but I guess that's who I am. Imagine I was sitting here and I cut my hand off, and you can maybe follow along in your mind if you want to, but please don't cut your hand off. But imagine you cut your hand off. What do you think it would feel like? Do you think that it would feel painful? Would it feel hot? Would it feel cold? Would you all of a sudden start seeing things that weren't there? Would you stop seeing things? Would you stop hearing things? I think that we all have a vague understanding of what something like that would be like, because we've all had minor cuts, some of us have probably had more serious injuries, but there's something fundamentally different about an injury to the brain. It seems like when you cut your hand off, your experience doesn't change except for that you no longer have a hand. But when you do something like you lose a brain, or a part of the brain, it's not that you just lose that part of your body. In some way, part of what it means to experience life goes away as well. So if you, just to be a little bit more specific, you have an area of the brain called the visual cortex in the back part of your brain. If you were to cut out this entire part of the brain, you would stop seeing things altogether. And that would, in some sense, prove to you that your experience of vision is, at least in some part, taking place in the brain. But if you removed your hand, let's say, you wouldn't expect to lose vision unless there was some sort of more systemic problem like blood loss and maybe even death. So with that said, that's just a sort of a layman's explanation of the brain, and I know that may be a little bit pandering, but I think that there are so many topics that we sort of take for granted. We just sort of accept that, oh, the brain's up there and it does thinking and feeling or something like that, and even though maybe we already understand that hearing and vision and smell and taste all are at least in part controlled and modulated inside the brain, there are some very strange things that happen in the brain that we don't really understand very well, that we can relate to vision or taste or these other sensory experiences. So I'm not going to dive too much into this because this is definitely a can of worms, but one of the things that I think is incredibly strange about the brain is it somehow feels as though it is something. So I'm talking into a camera right now, and a camera is basically just a computer. But do you think that that computer actually feels as though it is something? That's a difficult question, and I hope that you'll ponder that. But I don't think that that answer is so clear, and it's especially difficult because I don't have the ability to ask a computer, hey, do you feel like yourself? And let's take it a step further. Let's say I was gonna have a conversation with you and I was gonna ask you, hey, do you feel like yourself? If you told me no, how would I know that you're not lying to me? If you told me yes, how would I know that you're not lying to me? It seems like only you can really know whether or not you are yourself. That's a strange question. It's definitely difficult in terms of language. Just trying to talk about sorts of things like that is really, really sticky. And I'd like to get into it further at another point in time, but that's definitely for another video. So let's get back to brain-computer interface. You have a brain, which in my opinion is a sort of computer made out of biological parts, and it uses something actually very similar to the fundamental unit of a computer. So the fundamental unit of a computer, you might know this, is a transistor. Remember how I said that a neuron in the brain is like a little light bulb? It can be on, it can be off, it can tell its neighbors, hey, you should turn on, or hey, you should turn off. And a computer is very much the same way. So when you have a computer, you have electricity running around, and those tiny, tiny wires, whether or not they continue to send electricity along the path that electricity is running down, depends on transistors. So I don't know if I can get too much into that without some demonstrations. Maybe I could do that in a future video as well. But I really do think of computers as systems where information is traveling around. And it doesn't even have to be electrical. You can imagine the same sort of thing as a computer built out of pipes with water. And how you would have a display system based on that is a little bit difficult to figure out. But you could imagine that a water pipe computer could answer yes or no questions. So those yes or no questions would be answered by a sort of valve that either closes or it opens. And if it's open, that represents a yes. That could be like, I say, well, will I win the lottery next week? And this is just a random example. But the computer could answer yes or no based on whether or not the valve is open or closed. And you could build all sorts of complicated logical systems that could handle questions such as, will I win the lottery next week? And whether or not that computer is actually very useful would depend on how well it uses the information available in order to answer that question. So that actually raises an important point. Our brains and computers around us are valuable because of the way that they interact with information. So when I'm running around in the world, say I'm a soccer player and I'm trying to score a goal, I could be a really, really dumb soccer player, and I'm going to analogize that to a really dumb computer, and I could have a control system or a computer in my brain which only knows kick or don't kick if there's a person in front of me or not in front of me. And you could see how that is a computer in some sense. It's seeing, okay, is there a person in front of me? Is there not a person in front of me? And then reacting to that based on that information. And it produces some amount of information in the world by either kicking or not kicking. And although that would be a computer, it's not a very good one because it doesn't handle the available information well. So think about what a real soccer player is doing when they're playing this game. They feel the ball on their foot and they try to keep it close to them. They look around and they notice where people are and where people aren't. They're having all sorts of complicated calculations go on in their brain which are directed at a goal. And in order to achieve that goal, they represent the system around them. They use their body, they manipulate their body via that control system in order to achieve that goal. And that is at the heart of what it is to be a brain and what it is to be a computer. You use the information available to you to try and achieve some sort of goal, almost always. But that's a pretty narrow definition, but that's the one that I'm going to use for a while. And if somebody wants to contest me on that, fine, great, I'd be happy to. Or I'd be happy to answer whatever contestations you have, if that's even a word. You understand what I mean. So, brain-computer interface. This, to me, is deeply, deeply interesting because science is reaching a point where the systems that we're capable of building outside of our body are beginning to parallel the systems that work inside of our brains. So you may have been following some of the artificial intelligence revolution that's been happening over the past, 10, 20 years. And I say 10, 20 years because that's where applications, I feel like, have been most fruitful in artificial intelligence. But actually, the whole artificial intelligence movement goes way back to the beginning of the 1900s or early 1900s with a guy named Alan Turing, and even before that, sorts of things like automatons, which were wooden machines that were meant to act like fortune tellers and respond to speech and crazy things like that. Really amazing work. But lately, artificial intelligence has become deeply sophisticated in a way that is very similar to the human brain. One of the main tasks that I'm aware of that has been just astonishing in its scope and in the sorts of results that it's beginning to produce is artificial vision. So that means taking a bitmap of information. So you can think of any sort of picture or video is represented by a light or dark value, and then also some amount of color. So when you look at your TV screen, actually, you're seeing lots of tiny pixels that have some amount of red, some amount of green, some amount of blue. And what those colors are is a matter for another time. But basically, you can think of images as being broken down into these tiny, tiny parts. And computers are now capable of taking those digital representations of a scene or of an event, and then trying to understand what is happening in that picture or what is happening in that event. And that's very similar to the way that you might, say, look at a car and say, oh, that's a pretty car. Or you might look at a shelf at a store and say, oh, I need to buy ketchup instead of mustard. Although that may seem a little bit arbitrary, the sorts of things that may come from that are incredibly astonishing, because you could build a robot now which could go shop for you, and it would actually know the difference between ketchup and mustard just by looking at it. Not having to put some sort of QR code on it, not having to put some specific identifier, but interacting with the world similar to the way that you do. And to me, that is incredible. And it's specifically incredible because it shows that the things happening inside of our brain are not at the level of deities. And maybe there is something to be said about the spirit, the soul, whatever it is that you believe in inside of humans. And I am definitely fascinated to talk about those things. But there are clearly aspects of the brain and of the human experience which are grounded in reality, grounded in physics, grounded in chemistry, grounded in biology. And I think that's amazing, because maybe we can start to take control of those systems in really exciting and fun ways. And I probably sound like a crazy mad scientist right now, but think about the fact that now we understand how visual recognition works. What if we were able to recognize the patterns of electricity that were scurrying around in our brain, which do exactly that, pattern recognition? And say I could manipulate the electricity that's running around in your brain to where when you look at a bottle of ketchup, you don't actually see a bottle of ketchup. You see the same image, you see all those things, but I could change where that electricity goes in your brain to where now you recognize a bottle of ketchup as a dog, or a kite, or arbitrary other things. I think that it's just crazy to think that we could understand this system well enough to arbitrarily change the outcomes. And maybe it wouldn't be fascinating to change what you recognize when you look at a bottle of ketchup, but imagine that I could do something like tell your brain to perceive a beach while you're laying in bed at home. And not just any beach, but the best beach that you have ever been to. Your favorite beach. And it would be your favorite beach, because I could use the sort of informational packets that already exist in your brain in order to produce experiences for you, simply by changing the direction or the flow of electricity that's happening inside of you. I think that's absolutely amazing. And I think that it extends much farther than just sending you on vacation when you want to be on vacation. I think that we have the ability to do things like change our emotions directly. Imagine that I could take someone from a nation that was deeply, deeply aggressive towards another nation. And one of the examples that I've always thought of is the Israel-Palestine conflict. So one of the examples that I've always thought about is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Imagine that you were on, it doesn't really matter which side, but clearly that these two sides of this conflict have deep, deep resentment towards one another. And I don't want to get into why or how I feel about it necessarily. I don't have a lot of personal opinions on this. I just know that the Israel-Palestine conflict is something that goes back a very long time and seems somewhat incurable to most of the world. Imagine that you could take one person from Israel and one person from Palestine that have deep, deep resentment towards one another, and then you could put them in a room together and you could manipulate the electricity in their brain to where they didn't have the same emotional response they normally do. And I'm not saying that you necessarily make them love each other, or you manipulate them to where they automatically say, oh yeah, we're friends now. That's not what I mean. And I think those things are possible, but I don't think they're necessarily ethical. But I think there is a middle ground here. What if we could take deep, deeply resentful enemies and reduce the amount of electricity which represents their hate for one another? Then we could create spaces where we could have conversations with the people that we hate without necessarily feeling the ways that we normally feel. And I would argue that this is maybe the single greatest thing that brain-computer interface has to offer. We could begin to have conversations that are not entirely limited by the emotions that we feel. We've been slaves to our emotions for as long as we've been capable of having them. But our emotions used to help us. Our emotions used to tell us, oh, I get a bad feeling when I walk over by that tree. Maybe I should just stay away from it. And without really understanding why we should stay away from that tree, we stay away from it. And maybe it's because there's a poisonous fungus on that tree, or maybe it's because there's a snake over there or something like that. These visceral emotional responses were our thinking mechanism for a long time, and I don't have the deep empirical backing for this. This is just a conversation, but I'd like to dive into some of this in the future. But I really do feel this way, that our emotions are a somewhat outdated technology that we struggle against deeply. I think that's a lot of what Sigmund Freud was talking about with the id and the ego. We struggle against this part of ourselves that we're aware of, but only partially. And for whatever awareness we have of our emotions, we have much less control over them than we do our thoughts. I mean, try this. Think of a specific kitchen utensil. Can you do it? Probably. It's kind of a dumb thing, but you can do it if you want to. And maybe it's hard to turn that off if somebody implanted that idea in your head, but once you start having some other thoughts, it seems pretty much gone. But when you have an emotion, when you feel angry at someone, or when you're deeply upset, or even when you're ecstatic and maybe even in love, those things stick with you. You carry that into the next experience. You carry that into your job. You carry that home. And I don't think we necessarily want that to be the case. We'd like to have more positive emotions, but when our negative emotions become stuck to us and we don't feel as though we can get away from them, what are we to do then? It seems like we go to therapy, we exercise, we have all these sorts of tricks so that we can get ourselves out of that headspace. But what if it was a switch? What if there was a helmet you could put on and all of a sudden you could choose how you'd like to feel? Or maybe there'd have to be deep regulations on something like that, and you could put on a helmet that would help you not feel aggressive or help you not feel hateful. And whether or not the ethics of that work out, I still think this is a technology that needs to be explored. And maybe even science labs are currently exploring this technology. And one of the things that's so difficult about such a new, beautiful, emerging field is people are doing incredible things with this technology, and they're not getting as much exposure yet as they almost definitely will in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So I want to try and dive into some of the more nitty-gritty research in order to uncover what is happening with this technology right now. And one day I'd like to work on it myself. So what you can take away from this video is that brain-computer interface is one of the most incredible technologies that our near future in science will produce, at least in my belief. And it can do things for us like put us places that we aren't. We could lay in bed and we could see whatever we want to see. We could smell whatever we want to smell. We could hear anything. And all with the help of very complicated computer systems. Computer systems which, even without mimicking the brain, are starting to do some of the things that the brain has already done. So it's that sort of convergence of the evolution that built the brain and the human understanding of the constituent parts of information systems merging together that will allow us to uncover some of the most incredible functions that our brain has to offer. And just one final closing note, I very much so hope that there are parts of the brain that computers can't copy. And I don't have any reason for believing that that's the case, other than just personal hunches, but I hope that there are things that our brain can do that computers will not be capable of. I only say that because I think that sort of secures life as an important part of existence. I think to this point, evolution and the biological process has been the greatest inventor of all time. And you can get into religious arguments there, but I really believe that the sheer guess and check method of millions and millions of years of evolution has created some incredible technology. And maybe there was some magic that went into that. Maybe it took some god with a lightning rod shooting it down from the skies to start everything off. Or maybe it took the most incredible, nuanced, careful construction by way of perfect accident for 13.2 billion years in order to get where we are. And whether you come from a theistic background or an atheistic background, I think it's important to recognize that something amazing happened along the way. And maybe the next great inventor will be us. It's not so clear to me that that steals anything away from the creation of the universe. I like to think of our world as a self-assembling ship in a bottle. Imagine that the beginning of the universe set everything in motion. And maybe even if there wasn't a creator, all that came after that initial moment was still a product of that first moment. And somehow, even though there was no hand putting pieces one by one on top of each other, gluing them together, making sure that they were exactly in the right form, maybe it was something so much more perfectly constructed that once its development was set in motion, there was nothing that needed to be touched. And I think that's amazing. I think that's truly, truly incredible. And understanding where we come from and understanding where we could possibly go, that's why I do science. So I hope you enjoyed this, and take care.